I'm Brady, 32 years old. I've got a degree in theology, and I lead a Christian media company of around 20 employees.
I'm Alex, I'm 30, I'm a bivocational pastor at a local church, and I work with this guy.
We've each been in positions of leadership for roughly a decade now.
So today on the show, we're sharing 3 books that have been hugely formative for us as Christian leaders.
Now, I will warn you, some of these books are not by Christian authors, or at least some of mine. Well, hey there, and welcome to the Bro Church Tools Show. We're here to help you and your church navigate the biggest communication shift in 500 years. I'm Brady Shearer, your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host. We call him the well-read religious man. It's Alexander Mills.
Hello, hello.
Discussing today 3 books that have made us better Christian leaders. We're going to go back and forth here. We don't know the other person's books. And you might say, well, there are only 2 on the table for each of you.
We haven't talked about them.
And apparently we only bought 2, but we're supposed to bring 3. We'll figure it out.
This is our podcast. We can do it if we want.
I'm going to kick things off here with my honorable mentions.
Okay.
Because how could you condense a series of books that have made us better Christian leaders into just 3?
When you told me we were doing this episode, I walked into my office or my study and I have 2 closet doors, and you open the closet and it's floor to ceiling, like literally ceiling to the point where I have to get on a step stool to get up to the top shelf of books. My closet is just books. And I stood there looking at this, and I was overwhelmed at the idea of choosing 2 books to the point, or 3 books, to the point where I almost closed the doors and texted you. I'm like, I can't do this. It's got to be a solo episode. But chose 3 with some honorable mentions, of course, because how could you just choose 3?
I like that you chose presumably 2. You're like, 3 is hard enough. I'm going to challenge myself to make it even more difficult. So my first honorable mention here is just autobiographies as a whole.
Okay.
Memoirs, just the category. 3 that I've read this year: Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey, Hustle Harder, Hustle Smarter by Curtis Jackson, a.k.a. Fitty, and A Promised Land by Barack Obama. Why do I love autobiographies as a category? I think that they make for a great addition to any person's reading diet, and I liken them to travel. You travel, you experience a different culture. It's a good reminder, it's a humbling reminder of how small you are in the world as a whole. Autobiographies are kind of like that, because you get brought typically into like, this was my childhood, and these were the struggles that I overcame, and this was my family life, and this was where I grew up, and then this is what I achieved and how I made a difference in the world. Almost always, it is so different than your own upbringing. But our upbringing, pretty similar.
Yeah.
Most of my friends and family upbringing, pretty similar. So it's great to be exposed to that different type of person, because...
And you listen to all of these, so you get to listen to them be read by... No, we're not getting into that. I'm just saying you get to listen to them be read to you by the author, by Matthew McConaughey or Barack Obama, and that is a privilege that is so recent, so modern. Like, any memoir prior to 10 years ago or whenever Audible became a thing, like, you weren't hearing it read to you by the author, but to hear those stories read to you by those people, I'm sure that's a really unique experience.
I purposefully put in the title 3 books that made us better Christian leaders, not 3 books we read.
Right.
Because it's a bit contentious whether or not an audiobook is considered a book that you read or not. That's a great point. Thank you for adding that.
Yes.
You wouldn't understand this.
I wouldn't, because...
But for everyone that is an audiobook listener, there is nothing quite as satisfying as when you get to the end of a book and you hear in that old-timey, grainy voice, Audible hopes you've enjoyed this message. They don't say message. Audio hopes you've enjoyed this program.
Okay.
And it's like, I finished the book. If you don't hear that, you didn't finish the book. Second honorable mention here, and notably, and I'll explain my reasoning for this, the only book by a Christian author. Though, I mean, Obama, Fitty, and McConaughey all talked about their faith. So technically, depending on what you categorize, but this is The Toxic War on Masculinity by Nancy R. Pearcey. What I'm loving about this book, and I am not quite done it so far, which is why it's only an honorable mention, because I have had some experience where you get 3/4 of the way through the book, and suddenly the author's like, here's what I really think. And you're like, oh, I know why you put this in the back of the book now. So what I've loved about this book, this is the 3rd one that I've read on masculinity this year, is that it's part history, part sociology, and part theology. And one of the reasons that I don't typically read all my books from Christian authors is because often the books are like primarily theology focused. I have my degree in theology. I'm still recovering from all of the theology books that I read during my degree. And so what's so cool about this is that there's a lot of theology, but just as much history, just as much sociology, The thesis of the book is that in eras past, when men were not so nice to women, let's think the Roman Empire. What Christianity was amazing at was saying, hey, did you know that men and women are equal? And it was awesome. And then now, where you've kind of inverted it, where society might say, hey, men are trash. All men are trash. It's scripture's like, hey, no. Hey, actually, men are good for these reasons.
Right.
And the whole thesis is how Christianity reconciles the sexes across all of history. And it is bolstered and supported by sociological studies and a ton of research, which I love, of course. One very interesting takeaway from this book. So you'll often hear about, Christian abuse in the church. And what this author does a great job of is separating kind of the studies that are often lumped together. And what she demonstrates is that Christian men, evangelical or Protestant, that attend church, I think it's like 3 or more times per week. So what they would qualify as a devout Christian are the least likely to get divorced, the most likely to be involved in the home, the most likely to believe in the permanence of marriage, and the most likely to not divorce. Nominal Christians, those who would check the box, claim the same beliefs, but don't actually attend church, most likely to get divorced, most likely. And so what happens often is that these two kind of get put into the same
of the Christian label.
Exactly. Very fascinating.
Yeah. This book I haven't read it. It's very well reviewed. And so I don't think you're in for a dramatic turn of events.
No, praise God.
Last chapter. And if I'm correct, she also wrote the book Love Thy Body.
That's correct.
Which is also very well reviewed. So. Yeah, nice.
Honorable mentions for you?
Honorable mentions for me, I threw in, geez, I'm annoyed at myself already. The first one is the Sermon on the Mount, which I had to include because I was standing in front of my books and a third of my books are Bibles. I collect Bibles. I have like over 100 Bibles. And I wanted to just say like, oh, the Bible, which is too much. But truthfully, there's no piece of literature that has been more formative to me in my Christian leadership than the Sermon on the Mount. So I had to include it. Then I have the Didache, which is like an early Christian writing that kind of documents the life of the apostles and like what Christian lifestyle looked like in 1st, 2nd, 3rd century post-Christ. So like folks had been with Jesus, had heard of Jesus firsthand, secondhand, and are now trying to practice things or practice this life that way. So I'm always curious, like, okay, the people who are in closest proximity to Jesus, what did following Jesus look like for them? And so that kind of gives us some good insight there. There's a really short book. It's almost like a handbook called Being Christian by Rowan Williams. And it is such a great introduction or reaffirmation of like the basic tenets of Christian faith. So like things like communion and baptism and prayer, like just, it's a very small book. I don't know, it's probably less than 100 pages. So it's a good refresher, reminder. It's a good handbook for folks who are just being introduced to the faith. It's very approachable.
We all love a short read.
Being Christian, yeah.
We stand a short king and a short read.
That's right. Speaking of autobiographies and biographies, memoirs, I have A Burning in My Bones, which is Eugene Peterson's biography, and Pastor, which is his memoir. Read both of those this year. We'll talk about Eugene Peterson a little bit later.
Shocking.
I know. How to Survive a Shipwreck by Jonathan Martin. That's a good book about just how to navigate trials and trouble in Christian life. What else? Oh, and Why Would Anyone Go to Church? This is a book written by actually a local pastor here, a friend of mine named Kevin Makins. He's a pastor of Eucharist Church in Hamilton. And he wrote this book asking the question that a lot of us, he was asking this question before COVID, but a question that a lot of us found ourselves asking during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is like, why do we go to church? And I think he's put forth a really great effort to answer that question. It's been so helpful to me as a pastor. So those are my honorable mentions.
Perfect. I'm going to kick things off here with my first book. And the way that I have written the notes for these books is I've talked about where I kind of was in my life when this book came along. And all three I read this year. Tried to keep it recent. And then also concepts that I wrote down while reading the book, listening to the book. These books were so good, though. I bought the physical copy.
Yeah, hardcovers too.
I really liked a book.
Yeah.
When I listen to it, and then I go and buy the actual hard copy. And so hopefully those concepts irrespective of if you read the book or not, are going to be helpful and illuminating. Why are none of the 3 books that I chose, spoiler alert, written by Christian authors? And how did these books help me as a Christian leader? So my feeling is that all of these books help me live by my Christ-centered principles. So they didn't shape my worldview, let's say, but they helped me actually live it. And I'm a firm believer that like all truth is God's truth. And these 3 books kind of all in their own unique category of things in my Christian life that I've kind of had to like figure out this year, or at least take steps forward in. And they were extremely helpful and rooted in like the Christian principles, the Christ-centered principles that I want to live my life by. First book is called The Comfort Crisis. This is written by Michael Easter, and shockingly, is not the first book that I've read this year, where I bought the book based on its title and on a recommendation, thought it was one thing, only to figure out, psych, it's about a bow hunter. It's happened twice now.
Got him.
Now, Alex, as you may not know, himself is a bow hunter.
I didn't know that. I knew that the other one was about bow hunting. I did not know that this one was about bow hunting.
And we're entering hunting season.
We are so close.
How excited are you?
I can barely contain it. I am doing my very best to not talk about it on this show because it's not necessary, but it's all consuming in my life right now.
Now, when Alex first became a hunter,
Maybe I'll read this. Maybe I'll bring it to the forest.
you should.
Yeah.
You read pretty recently, 2 years ago.
What's that?
You picked up the discipline.
Yes, this is my 3rd year hunting. It's my 4th year like progressing towards hunting, but my 3rd season actually hunting. Yeah.
So Alex picks this up and I'm like, what are you doing? I don't come from a history of that.
Right.
It was unfamiliar to me. And he, as he always does, very aptly and delicately and compassionately explains it to me. And I go, okay. I read this book and I'm like, wow, I get it now. Like, how is that? Like, your best friend, he's like, hey, this, and then you're like, nah, I'm not feeling it. Yeah. Some random person writes a book, you're like, oh, it's so profound.
That's all right.
The best part was the second book that I read, which we don't have to reveal. I knew what Alex was going to say. And I was like, I'm not going to tell him I'm reading this book. I get to the end, and he starts talking about God. Again, this happens. They get to the end of, did you know about the Lord? I'm like, yes, I know about the Lord. And I'm like, hey, man, I'm reading this book by another book. He's like, who is it? I tell him the name. He's like, oh, no, that dude sucks. And I knew it was going to happen. Against my better judgment, I let him know. Okay, so what's really cool about this book is that it is equal parts memoir of this guy becoming a hunter, and then also dense sociological and empirical studies on comfort. And to prove my point, at the end of the book, he's like, there are accompanying materials if you want to see all of my citations and sources, to which I said, yes, please. Yeah. And I printed them out. Little did I know, when I started printing them out, I was going to have to get a new ink cartridge. Yeah. Because, this, just citations from the book. So this is like the perfect marriage between storytelling, which grips you, and he weaves a single story kind of throughout the whole book. So you kind of take a break, and then he's like, and let me tell you about citations. I'm like, nice, I love citations. And then he goes back to the story. I'm like, boo, hunting. And by the end of the chapter, I'm like, wow, I could also survive in the Alaskan wilderness. Brilliantly done. Let's talk about where was I when this book kind of met me in my life. So I read this at the beginning of the year during just a really challenging season where a lot more was required of me across every kind of vertical of my life, family, work, kind of personal health. And I was like, I don't know if I'm up for this. And I was just thinking about the story of the rich young ruler because, despite it being a really challenging part of my life, relatively, I am financially secure. I am in a very happy marriage. I have 2 beautiful daughters. I love being a dad. The work that I do is fulfilling. I love the Lord. Relatively speaking, all is good. I would be maybe the depiction of that rich young ruler. And he comes to Jesus and he says, Lord, what must I do to enter the kingdom? And he's like, well, maybe sell everything you have. And the young rich ruler walks away in despair. Did I get that story right?
Yep.
Nice. I'm not the pastor here. Theology, I had my degree, it was a little while ago. I want to make sure I have that right. And, sometimes I think about myself, but all of us in the time that we live in are living in unprecedented levels of comfort. Things are easier than they have ever been. We have more recreation than we have ever had. We have food and substances and television and sports and hobbies and anything to just make us feel good.
Supermarkets, you don't have to hunt your food if you don't want to.
Right, not all of us are stockpiling elk and preserving foraged mushrooms over the winter.
Yeah.
And so this book was really great at meeting me in that place and challenging me. So some of the concepts that I took away, the first one is called problem greed. And the idea behind this concept is that as we experience fewer problems, we don't become more satisfied. We just lower our threshold for what we consider to be a problem.
Yeah.
And is that not human nature, right? Again, this is not by a Christian author per se, but is such a true concept that we would find in scriptures, like humanity. Like, we could just make a problem out of anything. And that's why there's so much throughout scripture for practicing gratefulness and the spiritual practice of gratitude, because it's almost this prophetic resistance against, as this author described it, problem greed.
Yeah.
We end up with the same amount of problems. It's just our new problems become increasingly more hollow. So the problem might be when I am rushing to get to this podcast this morning, and I'm making my oatmeal, and I am in haste scooping the skyr yogurt a little faster than I should be, and it lands on my hand. And I go, oh, I'm already late.
This is the worst thing that could happen.
And then, one of our coworkers who got to the office first today posts in Slack, hey, there's this beeping by the router. And I'm like, beeping? We have to record. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
Concept number 2.
Yeah.
Comfort creep. Kind of the evil brother of problem greed. Today's comfort is tomorrow's discomfort. The example that I always use for this is that the first time I flew on a plane, the first 10 times, my family, we never went on planes. We definitely were not buying the food that was on planes. I remember the first time I bought the chicken wrap on an Air Canada flight, and I was like, I'm eating food in the air.
Yeah.
This is the coolest thing that's ever happened. Now I go on a flight, they break out that styrofoam wrap, and I go, boo!
Yeah.
One time I had business class food. I know what you really got back there. So what was this luxury? What was this pinnacle of this amazing experience has become yuck. And then concept number 3, the toughening phenomenon. Facing non-overwhelming adversity is optimal for well-being. I like to describe this as manufacturing adversity in your own life. This can be as simple as pushing yourself in a workout or deciding not to eat a comfort food. It could be as simple as that. But if all we do is live in comfort, it's actually bad for our well-being. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, if you're always in actual crisis, that's not also optimal for your well-being. But there's this nice middle ground where non-overwhelming adversity is the sweet spot. And so how can you find that in your life? How can you manufacture it, whether by pushing yourself physically or mentally or whatever it might be? Because otherwise, you're kind of you're experiencing atrophy in a sense.
You and I have talked about this book quite a bit, but I'm just learning now that there is a bow hunting thread that weaves throughout the entire book. And a lot of what you're describing resonates so deeply with me about my experience hunting. And so I might have to get I don't know if there's a paperback version of that book.
But you don't like a hard copy?
No, I do, but not in the forest. So I might pick it up, and it might be my hunting read this year.
Oh, right, because you're mostly just doing nothing.
You do a lot of sitting and waiting, yeah.
The meat is dry, Merlot red, and resting in rows. There are 2 50-pound hindquarters, 2 35-pound front quarters.
That's a big animal. Elk. Sounds like he's hunting elk. That's a dream hunt for me.
Okay.
Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
Book number 1.
Yes.
This is called Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God by Pastor Brian Zahnd. He's a pastor from St. Joseph, Missouri. And the foreword is by William Paul Young, who wrote The Shack. So two kind of controversial evangelical men. I was introduced to Brian Zahnd by my dad and to this book by my dad. And actually, this book was my introduction to a very popular sermon, if not one of the most popular sermons in American history, called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. The title of this book is a play on that sermon. The sermon was given by Jonathan Edwards in the 1740s. We're talking a 250-year-old sermon that has such renown, it has reverberated through American church history until this time. And I want to read you an excerpt from that sermon, which is found in this book, early on in the book. And this is the excerpt from that sermon. If for those who are listening or watching who have no experience, who have never heard of this sermon before, this is the moment in this sermon. This is the apex moment. Pastor Jonathan Edwards says that God holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you, and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times so abominable in his eyes as the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours.
Oh, 10,000 abominable.
Right. So that's a lot. And the success of this sermon and that idea that still exists today is to coerce people to believe in God by means of being more afraid of, less in love with God and more afraid of what God can or will, or even in this sense, wants to do to you, what he thinks you deserve. And so the image there that Jonathan Edwards is painting is God holding you over a pit of fire like a spider. And the image that Brian Zahnd paints, and the whole thesis of this entire book, is that God by nature is not wrath, but by nature is love. And so the image that Jonathan Edwards is painting is that wrathful God with the spider in his hand, but the image that Brian chose for the cover is like a father cradling a son. And I don't know, I like the thesis expands to suggest that God is less like an indignant or angry power in the sky, but more like a father who is just anxiously awaiting to throw a party for his long-lost son. And this idea was not new to me. I never heard a sermon preached like Jonathan Edwards in my church growing up.
You didn't go to Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames?
Never.
Oh, that was just my church.
Yeah.
Apparently my church invented that. Anyway, go ahead.
And that's what I want to say is, like, I grew up in a church in a place, never hearing a sermon like that or theology that like even approached that idea that God is that God is wrath by nature and not love by nature. But that idea like permeated the evangelical culture that I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s. And so although I didn't hear it locally in my church, I heard it. I whether it was at youth conferences or I mean, my dad was a pastor. We went around and like I knew that people believed that about God. And I knew that people that were in my camp, that were in my Christian tradition, believed that about God. And so this book didn't as much give me a new idea of what God is like, but it put language to what I already believed about God. And I felt so affirmed. I felt so excited reading this book. I don't know of another book that I've ever read that has made me feel like viscerally this deeply, that has resonated so deeply like a chord within me, like, yes, this is what I believe. And so I'm not the kind of person to read a book and go around and like buying copies and like just giving them to people. Like we all know that person, or like the person who listens to a podcast and it changes their life. So they just text it to everyone they know. They post on Facebook, like everyone needs to listen to this podcast. I'm not like that. But in my life, and we're talking about Christian leadership here, you're leading a big Christian company. I'm leading a small Christian church. Like in my life and ministry, this book comes up often because this idea comes up often. It's like, God is mad at me. God doesn't like me. God hates me. And my immediate response is like, well, God, the story that Jesus tells is that God is like a father who just wants his son to come home. And when he does come home, has arms open wide and wants to throw a party. And so this book comes up, and to the point where when I grab this copy off my shelf this morning, this is not my copy. My copy is all marked up. This is not my copy. Somebody has my copy because I do pass around this book often.
You give away your copy.
Yeah.
Intimate.
Yes. Because like I know people who believe in Jonathan Edwards' sermon more than they believe in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, or the words of Jesus. And this book is such an effective vehicle at getting you there, getting away from the idea of God being so angry that he wants to drop you as a spider into the fire, and towards the idea of him being so loving that he just wants to welcome you home. So, yeah, When we first started talking about these three books that we wanted to talk about, this was the absolute first one that came to mind.
Excellent. Do you know when you first read it?
Within the last decade?
Yeah, so you're early 20s.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
very formative time.
Right in the most formative time of my life so far, or my adult life so far, when I'm really putting together like what I believe for myself. And like I said, it was just, as reading it, I was like, oh, I already believe this, but I'm not sure I would have known how to articulate it this well. So it gave language to what I knew I already believed. And my dad deserves a lot of credit for that, because he is not just my dad, but he's my pastor. And so he's responsible for portraying the predominant image of what God is like to me. And reading this book, I realized, oh, my dad has taught me that this is what God is like. Yeah.
Outstanding. Second book that I've got, Outlive, The Science and Art of Longevity by Peter Attia, MD.
It's a big one.
This is the first book by Peter Attia, and what he claims will be the last.
Really?
Because this is one of those books that's with someone, because it was quite a beast to put together. As you can see, yes, quite large. So this book, if the first book came to me and was kind of speaking to my mental toughness, this book came to me during a period where I was examining my physical toughness. So April of this year. And the thesis behind this book is that death comes at two speeds, fast and slow. So doctor talks about in the early 1900s, most people were dying of fast deaths before the age of 50, whether that was an accident, infectious disease, or something similar. Whereas today, most folks die of slow deaths in their 70s or 80s. And he outlines what he calls the 4 horsemen of long death, those being heart disease, cancer, neurodegenerative disease, and type 2 diabetes / related metabolic dysfunction. Each of the 4 horsemen are intricately complex, which is why they're kind of long death sort of things. It's not complex if you get hit by a car during an accident. That is quite understandable, how the mechanism of death came about. He describes these 4 horsemen more of a disease process than an acute illness. Each one is cumulative. And the reason that matters is because every one of us has incredible sway over how much these affect us. There are, of course, genetic factors, but there's so much that we can do, and the younger you start, the better. And this doctor has a history of being this outstanding boxer and athlete, marathon athlete, endurance athlete. And he got to a certain age, I think in his 40s, and he was like, he's a lot wired like us. Like, I've achieved like the boxing things I wanted to achieve, and I've achieved swimming across whatever channel that I wanted to swim past. Like, and he was starting to feel like I'm working out, but I don't know why. So he comes up with this process, this idea called the centenarian decathlon. And the centenarian decathlon is 10 events similar to an Olympic decathlon that he wants to be able to do when he's 100 years old. And the point isn't that he lives to 100 and he's able to do them. The point is longevity, in the sense that not how long can I live, but how well can I live for as many years as God gives me. And he's begun doing this with his own patients. He has them outline their centenarian decathlon. He's like, hey, do you want to be able to pick up a 20-pound suitcase and put it in the overhead compartment when you're 100? Oh, I do. Okay. Well, you're 50. Can you do this right now? Because we know that strength decreases at this percentage over this amount of decades. So if you can't do this now, there's no hope for you doing it then. And people are like, oh. He's like, if you want to be able to do this, if you want to be able to walk up a flight of stairs on your own at age 100, then your VO2 max at the age of 40 needs to be this, and yours is half that. So you're not going to make it. You need to start making changes now. And so for me, this meets me in a place where I'm young enough to hear this and be like, oh, okay, I have tremendous sway over these outcomes in my own life. Okay, I want to be able to do that. And it also helped channel my kind of ambition towards something that is never truly achievable, but is always going to be like healthy in the here and now. It's not just like, oh, I want to get to this body fat percentage, or I want to have this much muscle mass, or I want to look this good, on this vacation, whatever it might be. It was something that would truly pay dividends for every area of life. And, if this first one is all about like mental toughness, this is physical toughness. This is like the fact that, hey, despite the fall, one of the amazing outcomes is that every one of us bears the image and likeness of God. That means that I am a caretaker in many senses of that image and likeness. And I want to be the best caretaker that I possibly can be. And so this led to a slew of different things. One, I got some blood work done, and it revealed a couple of things that I need to work on. I never would have known. Not only would I not have known, I would have not known what they were. Say, hey, this is not as good as it could be. Like, I don't know what that is.
Right.
I don't know how to improve it. I don't even know what it means, what like the implications are of it not being good. And then I've yet to tell you this, but I did another series of tests this past Friday. I had to drive all the way to Toronto, and I met with a clinician, and they ran me through a series of 4 tests. So the first was a DEXA scan, which I've wanted to do for a long time. It's DEXA is body fat percentage, muscle mass, bone mineral density, visceral fat.
Okay.
So I did that. Then I did a 3D shape test where they like have you on this like spinning thing and it gets you. Now I actually kind of have already done that at home. I have this spandex suit that has a lot of dots on it, and you just like take a picture, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock on your phone, like creates it. They were very close, and the clinician was like, how are these so close? He's like, you never know when tech is going to put me out of a job. The third one was a metabolic test, and the fourth one was a VO2 max test, which is, we all know what this looks like. It's in the movies where the person's wearing that thing on the mask and that mask on their face, and they're running on the treadmill. It's like, oh, I'm training for a big thing. That's a VO2 max test.
Okay.
So briefly, here were the 2 things that came out of this test. First, my VO2 max was in the 90th percentile for my age group. He's like, you must do a lot of endurance training.
So that was going to be my question, which is, I know you, and I know you don't do any endurance training, which not to your discredit. It's just like you prefer to lift weights and you go for a walk every day, which is great.
Yes.
But like, so where's that coming from?
Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah. He's like, oh, then it's just genetic.
Okay.
Because he says, he's like, I run 50 kilometers a week. I'm 10 years older than you. My VO2 max is about 70% of yours.
Wow.
He's like, you should compete in 5Ks. I was like, no, I want to get big. I want to have muscle. He's like, no, you're not predisposed to that.
You're not made for this.
But long distance, like, he's like, I was like, oh, okay. He's like, for you to come in untrained and score that high on a VO2 max, he's like, you play a lot of sports? I was like, no, like it's been a decade since I played a sport.
I just need to say this. I'm not prepared for you to go through like a 50-pound cut and start running to work. Please don't.
I don't want this in my life. Yeah, he's like, I want you to compete. I was like, I don't want to. So it was kind of disappointing because like, the great score was not something that I had worked hard to achieve, but was just given to me.
Grace, yeah.
And he was saying, he's like, you really should do something with this because others of us, we're out in these streets.
Right, wasted potential, yeah.
Precisely. It gets worse.
Okay.
The metabolic test was not something I expected to do. The metabolic test was developed, I think, to actually like help with burn victims, but the test is now used to help understand like what is your resting metabolic rate. Okay. Meaning, if you were in a hospital bed, how many calories would you need to just like maintain? And then there's a qualifier or a quantifier for how many calories you would need on top of that for just like walking around. And then there's a final one for exercise. So he comes in, and this, before we even talked about the VO2 max, he looks at me and he goes, first thing he says after we do all the tests, he sits down and he's like, do you ever feel like you can just eat?
I'm like, yeah.
And I go,
I feel that.
Yeah. He's like, I have never seen a metabolism the way yours just scored.
No way.
He says the average person of your age and weight and gender should have a resting metabolic rate, an RMR, of 1,750 calories.
Sure.
Meaning if you just were in a hospital bed, that's how much you need to kind of just like maintain your weight.
Yeah.
He's like, you have 750 more calories than that. So your base is 2,500. He's like, which means just from like having a sedentary job and like not being in a hospital bed, you need to eat 3,200 calories a day to just maintain your weight.
That is so much food.
And he said, like, have you ever found that? And I took out my spreadsheet with my daily weigh-ins that quantifies your needed calories based on your daily weigh-ins. And I said, it's 3,200 exactly. He's like, well, that confirms it. You did your tests at home. We did the metabolic test. He's like, that means if you add exercise, for instance, if you ran a 5K,
right,
you'd be at 3,600 calories a day just to maintain. This is where it gets worse. Then he looks at my body fat percentage. He's like, about 20.7%. He goes, we could improve that. Basically what he said was, you have an amazing VO2 max. Your metabolism is outstanding. You've done nothing with either of those things. Yeah. He goes, your muscle mass, about exactly average for a person of your age. He's like, have you ever lifted before? And I was like, yes!
I lift every day. I lift so much.
So in one sense, I was like, thanks, Dad. On the other sense, I was like, this is so upsetting.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, this book is what led me to this pain in my life. So,
wow.
Thank you. That's mental toughness. We got physical toughness. And now back over to you.
And now you have more data points.
Dude, I have a new spreadsheet
Of
called
course you do.
Benchmarks
Yeah.
that is going to be like over 40 years. We're going to track this. It's exciting.
Well, hey, we mentioned Eugene Peterson earlier. I've talked about him on the show. And for those of you just tuning in, or maybe I haven't said it this explicitly on the show, this year I turned 30. And I am not much for like sentimentality around dates like that, birthdays, anniversaries. Like I'm just not wired for that. I just don't care. So turning 30 to me meant really not much at all. Although, in saying that, I felt internally this like, I still don't know how to describe it, but like this grace or like this prompting, this leaning into like stepping into a new season of my pastoral work. And it coincided with turning 30. I don't know if it just like, if I'm letting go of a kid complex because I feel like being in your 20s, you're kind of like a kid, but being 30 is like a grown up. I don't know what it is. There's a part of that to it. So all of that to say, I have just been stepping into new grace in my pastoral ministry. And I knew I needed help with that. And in a time where a lot of popular preachers and pastors seem to be falling in many senses of that word, I needed to look towards someone who finished well, who ran the entire race well and is done, you know? And so Eugene Peterson was the first one that came to mind. I have some real life people who I'm working through this with, but Eugene Peterson was the first one that came to mind. His memoir is called Pastor. He is a pastor's pastor, and from all accounts, he lived and finished well. He died in 2018, I think. And so this year, I've dedicated to only reading Eugene Peterson, which has been a large undertaking. And coming to the end of this year, I just finished another one of his books this morning. I feel like I know him as well as you can know him from a distance. And so it was hard for me to not, for all three of my books to not be Peterson books. But the one that I have read that has really shaped my Christian leadership, my pastoral ministry, is this one called Working the Angles. The subtitle is called The Shape of Pastoral Integrity. And this is his book about being a pastor and practically being a pastor and what that looks like. So the thesis is, in the same way that a triangle has 3 angles, pastoral ministry has 3 angles that require attention and that give strength and structure to the whole thing. And he says this, that these 3 pastoral acts are so basic and so critical that they determine the shape of everything else. But he says, besides being basic, these acts are quiet and in some ways unseen. And the 3 acts are prayer, scripture reading, and giving spiritual direction or pastoral care. And the entire thesis of this book and the nature of those 3 acts being so quiet and invisible, it kind of swims upstream against the popular idea that as leaders, we need to be more productive, more efficient, more impressive, all for the sake of the gospel, of course, But Eugene suggests here in this book that the strength of any pastor or Christian leader is built on things, and specifically these 3 things that are quiet, often entirely hidden. And these angles are prayer, scripture reading, and giving spiritual direction. So in my pastoral ministry, in my Christian leadership, those 3 things were not foreign to me, of course. And so it was both an affirmation to me, but also an enlightenment of the way that a seasoned pastor prays, the way that a seasoned pastor reads scripture, the way that a seasoned pastor and Christian leader gives pastoral care. I've talked about Sabbath on the show before, and that was part of this book in his portion on prayer, talking about Sabbath and rest. And he defines Sabbath as praying and playing. And that has been so personally transformative to me in the way that a lot of leadership books aren't. A lot of leadership books say, well, you need to make more use of your waking hours. You need to be more productive. And Eugene's saying you need to not do anything. You need to play and pray. And in the resting, in the not doing, you will be a more holistic pastor and person, husband, father, friend, Christian leader. And so all of his books have really shaped who I am they are shaping who I'm becoming as a pastor and as a Christian leader. But like practically, this is the one where it's like, okay, you got 3 things to focus on. These 3 things are the foundation of everything else. And you're going to do most of them in quiet. Nobody's really going to see you doing these things, but what they will see is the fruit of them.
Excellent. Third book that I've got, I've been calling
Where is it?
Okay, so yeah, this one I've only read, and by read, I mean listened to.
Right.
And I was like, oh, maybe Amazon can ship it before we do this episode. Wasn't going to arrive in time. And I've described these so far as, mental toughness, physical toughness. Maybe a better word is discipline.
Okay.
Mental discipline, physical discipline. This final one, financial discipline. This is The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. I read a good amount of financial books. Most of them are very practical. And what I liked about this one was it was all about how we think about money, how we feel about money. And I am the CEO of this company, but I'm also the CFO because I like it. That means I oversee millions of dollars of budget. I have tax liabilities in multiple countries. I have dozens of employees on payroll that have to be compensated. I have my own financial interests and goals. And then I'm also I own the company 100%. So I have my personal finance, but then I also have to oversee the entire company's finances. And it's multiple companies. It's a lot. And the more the company grows, the more employees that join, the more you feel the burden of the people in your care. And you just feel everything more and more. And I was realizing I need to ascend to another level of financial discipline, of financial acuity, and just sharpness and understanding what is driving these emotions and feelings so that I don't let them make the decisions, because that's what almost all of us do with money. We all like to believe that our financial decisions are empirically motivated, they're practical, they are budgeted. Most of the time they're emotional. We can tell a narrative that we will believe ourselves. So I'll go through these quickly. The kind of 5 concepts that I took away from this book. The first one is kind of the malleability of a generation's view on economics based on just when they happen to be born. So the author's example is, hey, if you were born in the 70s, the stock market increased almost 10 times in your teens and 20s. If you were born in the 50s, so let's say that same generation's parents, the stock market was flat for your teens and 20s. 2 groups of people separated by birth year, developing very different views of how financial markets work during, as we talked about for you, the most impressionable and formative years, and how your entire worldview on money could be dramatically different than your parents just because of what the economic markets did, not over a century, but over a 5 to 10 year period. And understanding that we think of things in our time as hey, my entire adult life, 10 years, it's been this way. It must be this way always. We're going through a period that's inflationary. We're going through a period of high interest. I remember when I was a kid, my dad was like, yeah, our first home, you weren't even alive, son. We had a 12% interest rate. And I was like, what does that even mean? I'm 32 years old. There's never been high interest. There's never been high inflation. This is brand new. Never really experienced economic markets like that. Concept number 2, the more extreme the outcome, the less likely you can apply its lessons to your own life, because the more likely the outcome was influenced by extreme ends of luck or risk. This was illuminating because when you think about I'm reading the story of Steve Jobs, it's always these extreme examples that get the most highlight in pop culture. And what this book is saying is, hey, the more extreme it is, the more likely it's going to be put into a publication. The more likely the story is going to be front and center in culture, but actually the less likely it's applicable to you whatsoever. It's kind of the more ordinary people, the more ordinary stories that are going to be most applicable because they have the most control over those things. The more extreme the outcome, the more likely it was just a product of extreme luck or extreme risk, which could have gone in either direction. Concept number 3. The hardest financial skill is getting the goalposts to stop moving. Oh, this one still is, it convicts me every time I say it. You achieve something, you get to the top of the mountain, and you go, great, what's next? And what you just achieved a year ago, 10 years ago, 25 years ago, whatever, would have been considered that's the destination. But it's not the destination because, at least for my personality, it's okay, what's next? And realizing that it doesn't matter how little money you have how much money you have, there's always someone that has more. There's always someone that has less. And so unless you're defining things empirically yourself and holding true to that, it's always going to be a moving goalpost. Just a great quote here by Steve Jobs. It was in the book. Success is a lousy teacher. It seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose. This business was quite successful in my early 20s. And when things only go right in your formative years, you can develop a narrative because it's the only thing that you know. And I even remember in that time being like, this, okay, I feel like I need to be a little bit hesitant. It's like, okay, try something like this. It worked again. Okay. Fascinating. Concept number 4, you can't know what you'll want in the future. Just realizing my financial goals in my 30s different than my 20s. And right now I'm like, wow, I know what I want. But if I know what I want now and it's different than what I wanted in my 20s, probably what I'm going to want in my 40s is going to be different than what I want now in my 30s. Okay, so then that means that a certain amount of optionality, a certain amount of margin, or just a certain amount of like, hey, be kind to your future self. Do right by them now with your financial choices, because otherwise they're going to look back and be like, why'd you do that? Why'd you put us in a tough spot here? You had every opportunity to put us in a good spot. And then concept number 5, the asymmetry of losses and gains. This is the simple part of human nature that we all understand, which is you lose $100, feels a lot worse than when you get $100. And that equally in the same direction, there's an asymmetrical feeling to that, which means that we're weighting it differently despite it being exact on the scales.
Right. That's good.
Over to you. Last book. It's not here.
My third book.
It was an Audible book. You listened to it.
No. There's this monkish way of living.
Oh my God.
I'm going to do the most annoying thing right now.
You can turn on the podcast.
There is a monkish way of living called Liber Mundi, which is Latin.
Of course.
Yeah.
No,
you're familiar with it.
Very familiar.
And Liber Mundi, it's Latin, which means the world is a book. And it's this slow and steady way of living that, it's like moving through the world and through the created cosmos with like eyes wide open, ears wide open, heart wide open, to see the story that's being revealed through creation, as if the world was a book to read. And so that's my third book. It's the world. This Liber Mundi way of living is something I've really been practicing this year. Because for us Christians, we believe that the world is the Lord's and everything in it. And so in a sense, it's a reflection of God himself, God's goodness, God's creativity, God's grace. And so in that sense, like the world is not just a book to read, but the world is the book to read to learn more about who God is and what God is like. And in this age of leadership books and courses and conferences and mentorship programs, it's a popular idea and tempting ideology to lead your church like a CEO and to run your church like a business. It is. A lot of those ideas, those leadership ideas that are synonymous with that are built on the sensibility of corporate America and how to build bigger and better businesses. But what I'm learning is like, and this is not a new idea, but the kingdom of God is not like an empire. It's like a seed. It's like leaven in a loaf of bread. We talked about it earlier. It's like a sun. It's like a mustard bush or a herd of sheep. As pastors and Christian leaders, we're like shepherds. And the kingdom of God, it's like, to me, it's being found in the most unimpressive cracks and crevices of the created world, of the cosmos. So I'm trying to pay attention to the world. I'm trying to read it like a book, this Liber Mundi idea. I'm paying more attention to honeybees and to flowers and to leaves that are changing color. I'm looking for glory in dirt. I'm finding gratitude in the sky. I bought a bike, I'm trying to move more on my feet or on rubber than sitting on leather in my car. I'm listening to less podcasts, listening to less sermons. I'm trying to listen more to like friends and family and foes. I'm trying to read the world like a book, and that it helps me stay rooted and planted and connected in this place, like where we actually live in Niagara, to see this place for what it is, but also to see the people that I share this sliver of land with, to see them better. And that was really influencing I think, the way I relate to my family, my friends, but the way I relate to the people in our faith community, the way I lead people as a pastor, as a Christian leader, if you will. So that was annoying. I had the opportunity to do the most on-brand thing possible, and so I did it. But truthfully, I'm trying to move through the world that way, paying attention and reading the world as if it was a book. And I know it's making me a better person, a better Christ follower, and a better pastor.
I was being glib, but there's some profound element to that.
Hopefully they hung on.
Very fascinating. We are best friends. We do life together. We see each other a lot. Similar backgrounds, similar upbringings. Like, how different could our reading?
I know. Yeah.
Interesting. We'd love to hear your book.
Yes.
Send it into the text line, 1-800-485-3139, or you can post it below this video on the comments if you're watching on YouTube. And thanks as always for your time, attention, and trust. We'll talk soon.
Are you planning on like picking it up to like show the camera or something?
Yeah. Look, we only have 2 each. Where's your third? Oh,
Have to wait to
God.
find out. we should leave them up here.
We should?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm gonna put my notes in there. Okay.